For years, tenants had almost no leverage. Rents climbed relentlessly, applications got harder, fees multiplied, and renters were told the same thing on repeat: pay more or move farther out. In 2026, that dynamic has genuinely flipped in a specific, verifiable group of cities driven not by a weak economy, but by an old-fashioned oversupply of new apartments finally catching up to demand. This isn't a rumor or a vibe. Apartment List, Axios, Zumper, CoStar, and Yardi Matrix all point to the same cluster of Sunbelt and Mountain West metros posting real, year-over-year rent declines right now, some of the steepest the country has ever tracked. Nationally, the median asking rent across the 50 largest metros has now fallen for over 2 years straight, even as it remains meaningfully above pre-pandemic levels. That combination real relief for renters, alongside prices still well above 2019, is the nuance almost every rent crash video skips entirely. It also explains why this shift feels contradictory to a lot of renters. Prices are genuinely falling from their peak, yet the total cost of housing still feels heavier than it did 5 years ago, because both things are simultaneously true. We're counting down 10 cities where landlords are genuinely losing pricing power in 2026, and a few where the story is more complicated than the headline percentage suggests. Number 10. Naples, Florida. Naples might be the most underrated entry on this entire list, because the real decline here is sharper than most rent trackers even advertise. Zumper's data shows Naples apartment listing prices down roughly 11 to 16% year over year as of early 2026, driven by a Gulf Coast oversupply crisis severe enough that Naples' rental vacancy rate sits around 13.4%, with neighboring Fort Myers even higher at nearly 20%, and neighboring Sarasota close behind at 17%. Naples was never a typical rental market to begin, with its wealthier, older, and far more tied to seasonal and second home demand than almost any other city on this list, which is exactly why weakness here signals something broader about the region. Here's the pattern interrupt. Naples was supposed to be recession-proof, insulated by wealthy retirees and seasonal luxury demand. Instead, it's absorbing one of the steepest rent corrections in the entire country. Proof that even affluent, lifestyle-driven markets aren't immune to basic oversupply math when insurance costs and special assessments pile onto renters who suddenly have other options. A wealthy renter comparing Naples to Sarasota, Palm Beach, or Arizona can simply walk away from an overpriced lease in a way a renter with fewer options never could. And that flexibility is exactly what's forcing Naples landlords to cut asking prices rather than hold the line. Florida's broader insurance and condo fee crisis is compounding the pressure here too. Non-homestead property owners face heavier taxes. Special assessments on older buildings have become a widely shared fear. And those rising carrying costs are landing on renters in the form of higher asking prices that the market, in the end, simply hasn't been able to support. Number 9. Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake's rental boom ran on a simple formula. Buying got so expensive that renting looked like the only option, which let landlords hold firm on price for years. Tech jobs, mountain views, strong population growth, and steady California migration all fed a narrative that Salt Lake was one of the cleanest, most reliable rental markets in the entire Mountain West. Apartment List data shows Salt Lake City rents down roughly 2% year over year in 2026, a real reversal after a construction wave brought new luxury towers to downtown, Sugar House, and the suburbs stretching toward Lehigh and Draper. Here's the pattern interrupt. A market can be genuinely desirable, with the mountains, the jobs, and the lifestyle all still intact, and still lose pricing power the moment supply catches up to demand. Renters here are increasingly asking about utility costs and lease flexibility, not just square footage, a sign the negotiating dynamic has shifted even in a metro nobody expected to soften. Property managers who once let leads sit for days are now calling back within hours, a small but telling behavioral shift that shows up in leasing offices well before it shows up in a headline rent number. Buildings around downtown, Sugar House, South Salt Lake, Midvale, and Murray that once maintained wait lists are now the ones running move-in specials, a full reversal of the leverage renters had access to just 2 years earlier. Number 8. Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh became one of the defining pandemic migration stories, drawing tech workers, remote employees, and families who saw the Triangle's universities, research jobs, and clean suburbs as a genuine step up from expensive coastal metros. Axios's February 2026 data confirms the reversal is real. Median rents in the Raleigh metro down to 2% year over year, now sitting well below their August 2022 peak of $1,566. The Triangle has been one of the hottest construction zones in the entire Sun Belt for 5 straight years, and that pipeline is exactly what's now working against landlords. Here's the pattern interrupt. Raleigh's fundamentals, universities, research jobs, strong employment haven't weakened at all. This is a supply story, not a demand collapse, which means the softening here looks nothing like the demand-driven downturns that hit weaker regional economies during past recessions. Renters priced out during the 2021-2022 peak are now finding room to negotiate in submarkets like North Hills, Apex, and Morrisville that had almost no leverage available just 2 years earlier. Nationally, median rent for new leases is still roughly 20% above pre-pandemic levels even as the current decline plays out. A reminder that Raleigh's correction is giving back a slice of an extraordinary run-up rather than erasing the boom altogether. Number 7. Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte spent years as one of the South's great migration winners, a banking capital where developers kept betting that every new wave of young professionals would justify another luxury tower with a pool, a co-working lounge, and rent that would have shocked residents a decade earlier. That confidence has now met its limit. Charlotte's rent slide has stretched across 11 consecutive quarters of annual declines. According to Matthews Real Estate's Q1 2026 report, with average asking rent down 3.2% year over year and more than half of all Charlotte apartment properties now offering concessions, the highest level on record. CoStar separately reported in April 2026 that Charlotte's rent slide is moving at its steepest pace in more than a decade. Here's the pattern interrupt. Even inside that real correction, Matthews's own forecast projects rent growth turning positive again in 2027 as construction starts fall to their lowest quarterly total since 2025. This is a temporary supply glut working itself out on a visible timeline, not an open-ended, indefinite collapse. High-end, Class A properties are actually outperforming on absorption even now, a flight to quality pattern that suggests demand hasn't vanished so much as it's become far more selective about where it lands. Charlotte's active construction pipeline, roughly 18,000 units still underway as of Q1 2026, is second only to Miami and Nashville nationally, which is exactly why the correction here has run longer than in most comparable Sunbelt metros. There's simply more supply left to absorb before landlords regain the upper hand. Number 6. Tampa, Florida. Tampa rode the Florida migration wave harder than almost any other metro, pulled forward by sunshine, waterfront living, and the sense that it offered more affordability than Miami without sacrificing the excitement of a big city. It's now absorbing one of the more consistent corrections on this list. Apartments. COM showed Tampa rents down 2.5% year over year in April 2026, while Apartment List separately clocked the decline closer to 4%. Insurance costs, property taxes, and HO-dues have made holding rental property here meaningfully more expensive than it was 3 years ago. On top of new supply that was financed back when developers assumed endless demand. Here's the pattern interrupt. Tampa hasn't lost its appeal. People still want to live there, but still desirable and still able to charge premium rent have quietly become two different things in 2026. And landlords who conflate them are the ones getting caught flat-footed on renewals. Some short-term rental owners who once chased seasonal Airbnb income are now converting units to long-term leases as tourism softens, which only adds more competing supply into an already saturated long-term rental pool. A renter who moved to Florida chasing affordability is increasingly running the full math rent, insurance pass-through costs, HO dues, property taxes, and asking whether staying still makes sense compared with moving inland or leaving the state entirely, a question that simply didn't come up as often during the boom. Worth pausing halfway through this countdown, 5 cities in, and the pattern is already clear. This isn't isolated softness in one struggling region, it's a genuinely national supply story stretching from Florida's Gulf Coast to the Mountain West, hitting cities with completely different economies, climates, and populations in almost exactly the same way. Number 5. Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix has always been a boom and bust market, building fast and correcting fast, and 2026 is following that exact script. During the pandemic, remote workers, California transplants, and institutional investors all arrived at once, and apartment developers pushed deeper into the desert to keep pace. Apartment list data now shows Phoenix rents down roughly 4% year over year, one of the steeper declines among major metros driven by build-to-rent communities, suburban apartment complexes, and investor-owned single-family rentals that all expanded at once during the boom. Here's the pattern interrupt. Phoenix's climate is now part of the affordability conversation in a way it never used to be. Renters aren't just asking what the rent is, they're asking what the July electric bill will run. And that total cost calculation is quietly adding to the pressure, pushing landlords toward concessions rather than increases. Single-family rental investors who bought at inflated 2021-2022 prices are among the most exposed, since a $250 rent cut can wipe out a thin margin once mortgage payments, taxes, and vacancy costs are all accounted for. A house that once rented for $2,500 during the boom now often needs to settle closer to $2,250 to attract a tenant. A gap that sounds manageable until an owner factors in a month of vacancy between leases alongside rising insurance and maintenance costs. Number 4. Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville built its reputation on population growth, tourism, music industry jobs, and a steady stream of corporate relocations that made both long-term landlords and short-term Airbnb operators confident the good times would keep rolling. The city added more than 10,000 new apartments a year for 3 straight years, and renters are finally cashing in on that construction wave. Multiple 2026 reports show Nashville rents down anywhere from 1% to nearly 7% year over year, depending on the tracker and time frame, among the steeper corrections of any major Sunbelt metro. Here's the pattern interrupt. Nashville's occupancy rate, still above 93%, hasn't collapsed the way the rent numbers alone might suggest. This is a market where landlords are actively choosing to cut price to keep units filled rather than watching tenants disappear outright. A meaningfully different, more controlled kind of softening than a genuine demand collapse. Property managers describe a straightforward priority shift. Getting units filled now matters more than defending last year's asking price, which is exactly the kind of behavioral evidence that shows up in leasing offices before it ever reaches a headline statistic. Some owners are offering 3 or 4 months free rent alongside referral gift cards worth $1,000. Concessions that were nearly unheard of during Nashville's peak, though most industry watchers expect the bottoming out process to run its course sometime between now and next spring as the construction pipeline finally thins. Number 3. San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio has ridden the same Texas overbuilding wave that hit Austin. Marketed for years as a practical alternative with military stability, tourism, and lower costs than its flashier neighbor to the north. For several months in 2026, it actually claimed the nation's steepest big metro rent decline, according to Apartment List, with the median rent down roughly 5% year over year. Other trackers show smaller, but still real declines, from 1.6% to 5% depending on methodology, alongside a reported vacancy rate above 16%. Here's the pattern interrupt. San Antonio was marketed for years as the practical, affordable alternative to Austin, and it's now discovering that being affordable doesn't protect a market from oversupply once construction outpaces lease-ups, regardless of how reasonable the starting rent was to begin with. Even a modest starting rent, around $1,360 to $1,390 a month, couldn't stop the vacancy rate from climbing past 16%. Proof that oversupply is a math problem that doesn't care how cheap a market already was. Construction has simply outpaced lease-ups here for long enough that property managers are now empowered, in the industry's own words, to lower prices and offer more generous concessions just to keep pace with new deliveries still coming online. Number 2. Denver, Colorado. Denver's rental market spent a decade as one of the country's most reliable landlord stories, built on mountain views, breweries, tech jobs, and a steady stream of newcomers escaping expensive coastal cities. That reliability has now cracked. Apartments, Com and Axios both point to Denver, rents down roughly 4.8 to 5% year over year in 2026, among the steepest declines of any major metro, as a wave of luxury apartments and suburban projects delivered right as migration cooled and tech hiring slowed. Here's the pattern interrupt for renters who absorbed years of relentless annual increases. This isn't just relief on paper falling, asking rents alongside income growth, outpacing housing costs represents a genuine, measurable shift in financial standing, not merely a pause in the old upward trend. The broader Front Range region has followed the same pattern, with nearby Aurora also landing among the metro area's most notable rent declines as new construction and slightly cooler demand work through the market together. Investors who bought Denver rental homes during the boom, particularly those who financed at higher rates or counted on aggressive year-over-year rent growth continuing indefinitely, are finding even a modest decline enough to strain their cash flow, especially layered on top of a broader housing market where home prices haven't given owners an easy exit either. Number 1. Austin, Texas. No city captures 2026's rent reversal better than Austin. During the pandemic boom, Austin had everything a landlord could want: tech jobs, California migration, no state income tax, and a national reputation as the next great American growth city. Rents surged, developers built aggressively, and by 2022, the confidence felt permanent. Apartment List clocked Austin's median rent down nearly 6% year over year in February 2026, the single largest decline among major U.S. metros, a full reversal from 2021 when Austin rents had spiked 31% in a single year. Here's the final pattern interrupt, and it's the most important one on this list. Austin rents are still roughly 6% above their 2021 level even after this correction, meaning renters are getting real relief without prices actually erasing the pandemic-era boom entirely. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, Austin rents had jumped 31% in a single year, so even a historic decline is really just giving back a portion of an extraordinarily steep run-up, not returning the market to where it started. Austin has also been flagged as offering some of the smallest average apartment sizes for the price anywhere in Texas, a detail that suggests the correction here is about price, not necessarily about landlords suddenly offering renters more for their money. That's the distinction. Almost every version of this story blurs Austin's rent math has genuinely turned against landlords. But correcting hard and back to where it started are not the same claim, and confusing them is exactly how a real, well-documented shift turns into an exaggerated one. Developers who once assumed every new unit would lease within weeks are now offering the same kind of concessions Austin renters once feared missing out on entirely a month or more, free, reduced deposits. Gift cards proof that in the market that defined the pandemic rent boom, the psychological reversal has been just as sharp as the numbers themselves. So here's the honest read on America's 2026 rent reversal. All 10 of these cities are showing genuine, independently sourced year-over-year rent declines. This isn't a manufactured trend. But the size and cause vary enormously. Naples' correction is sharper than most trackers even highlight. Charlotte's has an explicit 2027 recovery timeline attached to it, and Nashville's occupancy data shows a controlled softening rather than a demand collapse. The common thread across every single city on this list isn't a weakening economy, it's supply. Developers who financed thousands of units during the pandemic boom are now competing for the same shrinking pool of price-sensitive renters, and for the first time in years, that competition is working in the tenant's favor. Nationally, the median asking rent has now fallen for well over 2 years straight, even as it sits meaningfully above pre-pandemic levels, which is really the whole story in miniature. Real, measurable relief, layered on top of a boom that hasn't fully unwound. Whether that favor lasts through 2027, as several of these markets' own forecasts already predict, is the question every landlord on this list is bracing to find out. For renters, the practical takeaway is simple. In every city on this countdown, asking for concessions. Comparing multiple buildings and negotiating renewals is no longer a long shot. It's increasingly just how leasing works here now. For landlords, the lesson is a little more uncomfortable. A rental market built on the assumption that demand would keep climbing forever was always going to meet its limit the moment enough new supply arrived at once and in 2026. 10 very different American cities are all discovering that limit in roughly the same way, at roughly the same time. The metros that built fastest and financed the most aggressively during the boom are, unsurprisingly, the ones now absorbing the sharpest corrections, while cities with tighter zoning and slower construction pipelines, largely in the Midwest and Northeast, are still seeing rents climb. That split is the real 2026 rental story, not a single national collapse, but a supply-driven reshuffling of power between landlords and tenants that's playing out unevenly, city by city, exactly as basic economics would predict.